They mistook my silence at the funeral for defeat. My sister Victoria strutted into court, certain the handwritten will she forced our grandfather to sign was her ticket to $1 billion empire. But she made a fatal error. She thought she was playing a game with me. But Grandpa had set a legal trap 10 years ago. The man in the black suit entering now isn't a lawyer. He is the detonator to her destruction. My name is Emma Smith, and I have learned that the loudest sound in the world is not a scream, but the silence of a family waiting for a gavel to fall. I sat in the very last row of the Westchester County Courthouse, a ghost in the machinery of my own life. The wood of the bench was hard against my spine, cold and unforgiving, much like the reality I had been living in for the past week. I pulled my scuffed wool coat tighter around myself. It was the kind of coat you buy when you are invisible to the world, a garment designed for utility, not admiration. The heavy oak doors at the front of the room swung open, and the air shifted. It was no longer the stale, dusty atmosphere of a municipal building. Suddenly, the room smelled of expensive perfume and unearned confidence. My sister, Victoria, did not walk into the courtroom. She arrived. It was a performance, a calculated entrance designed to suck the oxygen out of the room. She moved as if she were walking the red carpet at the Met Gala, not attending a hearing about our grandfather's estate. She wore a black dress that I knew for a fact cost $5,000. It was custom-fitted, hugging her frame in a way that was meant to suggest mourning but actually screamed dominance. The silk whispered as she moved, a soft, sibilant sound that grated on my nerves. There was no grief in her posture, only the rigid, upright tension of a predator who smells blood in the water. She was not alone. Flanking her were our parents, Robert and Linda. To anyone else, they looked like the picture of dignified bereavement. My father wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my annual rent, and my mother was draped in tasteful pearls and a veil that she lifted with practiced elegance. But I knew better. I saw the way their eyes scanned the room, skipping over the clerks and the bailiffs, landing briefly on me before flicking away in disgust. They looked at me with a cold, glassy detachment, as if I were a stain on an otherwise perfect oil painting of a happy family. I was the anomaly. I was the failure. I was the daughter who did not matter because I did not come with a portfolio of assets. Behind them trailed Marcus Sterling, even in a city full of sharks. Sterling was a great white. He was the kind of lawyer who didn't just win cases. He destroyed the opposition so thoroughly that they thanked him for leaving them with the clothes on their backs. He strode toward the plaintiff's table, his briefcase swinging with a heavy pendulum rhythm. He approached the bench before the session had even formally begun. Extending a hand to the court clerk with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth, it was confident. It was overly familiar. It was the handshake of a man who believes he has already won the game before the pieces are even set on the board. I watched them settle into their seats, the scrape of their chairs echoing in the high-ceilinged room. My hands clenched into fists in my pockets. The sight of them so comfortable, so assured, triggered a memory from just 7 days ago that burned in my chest like swallowed acid. It was the night Grandpa died. The heart monitor had flatlined, turning the rhythmic beep of his existence into a singular, unending tone of finality. I had been holding his hand, feeling the warmth slowly seep out of his fingers, sobbing until my throat felt raw. Victoria had been in the hallway, on the phone with her publicist, less than 1 hour after the doctors pronounced him dead. I was standing on the front porch of the estate where I had grown up. The wind was biting, carrying the icy promise of a New York winter. I remember shivering, not just from the cold, but from the shock. Victoria stood in the doorway, the warm light of the foyer framing her silhouette. She did not look sad. She looked busy. She had tossed my duffel bag down the steps. It landed in the snow with a dull thud. "Get out, Emma," she had said, her voice devoid of any emotion other than annoyance. I had stared at her, unable to comprehend the cruelty. "Grandpa is still in the room. Victoria. He is not even cold yet." "This is my house now," she had replied, checking her manicure, and I do not want squatters." She had snapped her fingers, and two men I had never seen before private security. She must have hired days in advance stepped out from the shadows. They wore uniforms that looked more like paramilitary gear than security attire. They escorted me to the gate like a criminal. As I stood on the sidewalk, watching the iron gates swing shut, I heard the distinctive mechanical whir of the locks being changed. She had a locksmith on standby. She had planned this while Grandpa was taking his last breaths. That memory was the fuel that kept me sitting upright in this courtroom. They thought they had broken me that night. They thought that by stripping me of my home, they had stripped me of my power. They looked at me now, sitting in the back row, and saw exactly what they wanted to see. They saw Emma Smith, the low-level employee at Onyx Archives. To them, my job was a joke. Onyx Archives sounded like the most boring place on earth, a dusty facility where people went to file papers and rot away in fluorescent lighting. They believed I spent my days sorting through boxes of tax returns from the 1990s. They believed I was living paycheck to paycheck, barely scraping by, certainly too poor to afford a lawyer who could stand toe-to-toe with someone like Marcus Sterling. They saw a woman defeated by life, wearing a coat that had seen better days, sitting alone because she had no allies. Victoria leaned over to our parents. Her voice pitched just loud enough to carry to the back of the room. It was a theatrical whisper, designed to be overheard. "I cannot wait to get the demolition crew in there," she said, smoothing her skirt. "That old library is a waste of square footage. It smells like dead paper and old men. I'm going to put in an infinity pool. Glass walls. It will be stunning for the summer parties." My stomach lurched. The library, that room was Grandpa's soul. It was where he had taught me to read, where we had spent thousands of hours discussing history, philosophy, and the importance of integrity. It was filled with first editions and handwritten notes in the margins of his favorite novels. To Victoria, it was just square footage. To her, history was just something you bulldozed to make room for vanity. She knew I could hear her. She wanted me to know that she wasn't just taking the money, she was erasing him. I kept my face impassive. I had practiced this expression in the mirror for 3 days. It was a mask of numbness. If I showed anger, they won. If I showed sorrow, they won. I had to be a stone. My father, Robert, stood up and adjusted his tie. He glanced at Sterling, who gave him a subtle nod. Robert turned and walked down the aisle toward me. He moved with a hesitant grace, the way a man approaches a stray dog that might bite. He stopped at the end of my row, looking down at me with an expression that was a grotesque mixture of pity and condescension. "Emma," he said, his voice dripping with fake concern, "you look tired." I said nothing. I just looked at his polished shoes. "Look, this does not have to be ugly," he continued, reaching into his inner jacket pocket. "We are family. After all, Victoria, she can be intense, but she is just thinking about the legacy. We all are." He pulled out a check. I could see the numbers even from where I sat. $10,000. He held it out to me, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. "Take this. Emma, it is a gift, a fresh start. Go back to your apartment, get some rest, maybe take a vacation. Sterling has a document for you to sign. Just a standard waiver. It says you will not contest the will. It is for the best. We need to save face. We do not want the press sniffing around a family feud. It would disrespect your grandfather's memory." The audacity of it took my breath away. $10,000. The estate was valued at over $1 billion. He was offering me pennies to go away, to disappear so they could pretend I never existed. And he dared to use Grandpa's memory as a bargaining chip. I stood up slowly. I was taller than my father realized. I looked him in the eye, and for the first time, I let the mask slip just a fraction. I let him see the cold, hard rage burning underneath. I reached out and took the check. Robert smiled, a relief washing over his face. He thought I had capitulated. He thought money was the only language anyone spoke. I held the check up between us. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, I tore it in half. The sound of the crisp paper ripping was sharp and loud in the quiet courtroom. I did not say a word. I did not need to. I put the two halves together and tore them again. Then I let the pieces flutter to the floor like confetti at a funeral. Robert's smile vanished. He took a step back, his eyes widening. He looked at me as if I had just pulled a knife. There was something in my silence that terrified him more than any scream could have. It was the silence of judgment. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that he did not know his daughter at all. He retreated to the front of the room, scurrying back to the safety of Victoria and Linda, whispering something frantic into his wife's ear. Just then, the side door opened, and the bailiff announced, "All rise." Judge Harrison entered the room. He was a man who looked like he had seen everything and was impressed by none of it. His robe was heavy on his shoulders, and his face was etched with the lines of 1,000 difficult decisions. He looked tired. He climbed the steps to his bench and sat down with a heavy sigh. Arranging his files with methodical slowness, he looked out over the courtroom, his gaze lingering for a moment on the peacock display at the plaintiff's table, and then drifting to the solitary figure in the back row. "Be seated," Judge Harrison said, his voice gravelly. He picked up his gavel and brought it down. The sound was a sharp crack that signaled the end of the preamble. The play was about to begin. I sat down, keeping my back straight. I watched Victoria lean in toward Marcus Sterling. She had a smirk on her face, a look of absolute, unshakable triumph. She covered her mouth with her hand, but in the acoustic clarity of the courtroom, her whisper carried straight to me. She barely looked at me as she spoke to her lawyer. "The girl does not even have a lawyer," Victoria whispered, giggling slightly. "This is pathetic. Today will be over in 5 minutes. Let us make sure we get a table at Le Bernardin for lunch." I stared at the back of her perfectly coiffed head. 5 minutes. She was right about one thing. The timing was going to be very specific. But she was wrong about who was holding the stopwatch. She thought I was alone. She thought I was broke. She thought I was the Emma she had bullied for 20 years. She had no idea that while she was planning pool parties, I had been working. She had no idea that the boring job at Onyx Archives gave me access to things she could not even imagine. She had no idea that the man she had forced to sign that will had been playing a game of chess with her for a decade. And she had just walked into checkmate. Let the vultures circle, I thought, smoothing the fabric of my cheap coat. They do not realize that the carcass they are fighting over is poisoned. Marcus Sterling did not just speak. He performed. He stood before the bench, adjusting his silk tie with the practiced ease of a man who charged $1,200 an hour for his presence. He treated the courtroom floor like a stage, his voice projecting to the back corners where I sat in my invisible exile. "Your Honor," Sterling began, his tone dripping with a honeyed gravity that made my skin crawl. "We are not merely here to discuss the distribution of assets. We are here to ensure the survival of a legacy. The Smith Empire is not a stagnant pool of money. It is a living, breathing organism comprising commercial real estate, technological investments, and philanthropic endeavors. It requires a captain with a steady hand. It requires vision." He gestured toward Victoria, who sat with her chin raised, looking the picture of stoic capability. "My client, Victoria Smith, has spent the last decade shadowing her grandfather." Sterling lied. He said it so smoothly that I almost believed him. He painted a portrait of a devoted granddaughter who had sacrificed her youth for the family business, a woman of sharp intellect and unyielding business acumen. He conveniently omitted the fact that the only thing Victoria had shadowed was her credit card limit, and her business acumen was limited to firing housekeepers who did not fold her towels correctly. Sterling continued, pacing before the judge. "It is about stewardship, Your Honor. Mr. William Smith built this empire from nothing. He knew, in his final days, that only one person possessed the fortitude to carry his torch. That person is Victoria Smith." I gripped the edge of the wooden bench. The lies were physical blows. They were rewriting history in real time, erasing the years I had spent managing Grandpa's correspondence. The nights I had spent reading financial reports to him when his eyes grew too tired, the quiet discussions we had about the moral weight of wealth. To Sterling, none of that existed. with a flourish that belonged in a magic show. Sterling produced a document. It was enclosed in a blue legal folder. I present to the court the last will and testament of William Smith, dated just 3 days prior to his passing, Sterling announced. The room went silent. 3 days. Grandpa had been in and out of consciousness for the last week. He had been lucid only in short, painful bursts. The idea that he could have read, understood, and signed a complex legal document 3 days before he died was ludicrous. It was impossible, but there it was. Sterling handed the document to the bailiff, who passed it to Judge Harrison. "In this document," Sterling said, his voice dropping to a reverent whisper, "Mr. Smith explicitly revokes all prior wills. He leaves the entirety of his estate, including the controlling interest in Smith Global and all real estate holdings, to his granddaughter, Victoria Smith. He recognized that splitting the assets would dilute the power of the company. He made the hard choice for the greater good." Then came the pivot. Sterling turned his body slightly, angling himself so that he was facing the judge, but pointing his accusation directly at the back of the room, directly at me. "Your Honor, the decedent was also clear about why he excluded other family members." My heart hammered against my ribs. Here it comes. "Emma Smith." Sterling said my name as if it were a dirty word. While it pains the family to air private grievances, the court must understand the context. The younger granddaughter has, unfortunately, been absent from Mr. Smith's life during his most difficult years. I almost stood up then. Absent, I was the one who changed his IV bags. I was the one who held the basin when he was sick. I was the one who slept in the chair next to his bed for 3 months. Guys. But Sterling was not finished. He lowered his voice, feigning sympathy. "Furthermore, there are concerns regarding her mental stability, following the tragic death of her husband 2 years ago. Emma Smith underwent extensive therapy for severe depression and erratic behavior. Mr. Smith loved his granddaughter, but he knew she was in no condition to manage a portfolio of this magnitude. He wanted to protect the business from her instability, and frankly, protect her from herself. Tears of rage pricked my eyes, but I willed them back. They were weaponizing my grief. They were taking the worst year of my life, the year I lost my husband and nearly lost my mind with sorrow, and twisting it into a legal argument for incompetence. I looked at Victoria. She wasn't even listening. She was inspecting her cuticles. "To support these statements," Sterling said, "I call Mrs. Linda Smith to the stand." My mother stood up. She smoothed her dress and walked to the witness stand with the air of a martyr approaching the stake. She took the oath, her hand trembling on the Bible. It was a perfect performance. "Mrs. Smith," Sterling asked softly, "can you tell the court about your father-in-law's state of mind regarding your daughter?" "Emma." Linda looked out at the gallery. She refused to meet my eyes. She pulled a lace handkerchief from her purse and dabbed at a dry eye. "Dad was heartbroken," Linda said, her voice wavering. She sniffed loudly. "He told me, again and again, how disappointed he was. He said Emma had become distant. He said she was angry at the world after her husband died. He was terrified that if she got her hands on the company, she would destroy it out of spite. He told me, 'Linda, promise me you will make sure Victoria takes the helm. Victoria is the strong one.' The lie was so massive, so grotesque, that it felt like the roof should have collapsed on us. My mother was sitting there, under oath, murdering my character to secure her own financial future. She knew Grandpa adored me. She knew I was the only one he trusted, but she also knew that if Victoria won, the money would flow. If I won, the party was over. "Thank you, Mrs. Smith," Sterling said, looking solemn. As my mother stepped down, weeping fake tears into her lace prop, I looked at the plaintiff's table. Victoria had her phone hidden behind her purse. I could see the glow of the screen reflecting on her chin. She wasn't mourning. She wasn't even paying attention to the perjury her mother had just committed. She was tapping away on the Open Table app. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was confirming a reservation for 4 people at Le Bernardin for 1 o'clock in the afternoon. She was ordering the tasting menu in her mind while her lawyer massacred her sister's reputation. Sterling returned to the center of the room. He was going for the kill now. Your Honor, given the volatility of the market and the clear intent of the decedent, we move for emergency guardianship. We ask that the court grant immediate control of the assets to Victoria Smith to prevent any stagnation or loss of value. We need to protect the enterprise from decline. Every hour of delay costs the shareholders money. We ask for a summary judgment to transfer titles effective immediately. He wanted it all, right now. He wanted to bypass the probate period, bypass the investigation, and hand the keys to the kingdom to a woman who thought fiduciary was a type of pasta. Judge Harrison lowered his reading glasses. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, looking exhausted. He had seen greedy families before, but perhaps the sheer velocity of this greed was wearing him down. He looked past Sterling, past the weeping mother, past the bored heiress, and locked eyes with me. Ms. Smith, the judge's voice boomed. I felt every eye in the room turn to me. You are not represented by counsel, he asked. I shook my head slowly. No, Your Honor. The judge frowned. These are serious allegations. Ms. Smith, they are petitioning to cut you out of the estate entirely and questioning your mental capacity. Do you have any objection to these proceedings, or do you concede to the plaintiff's motion? The room was silent. Sterling had a smirk playing on his lips. He expected me to crumble. He expected the unstable widow to burst into tears, or the poor administrative assistant to stammer and accept defeat. Victoria finally looked up from her phone, her eyes bright with anticipation. She was ready to watch the bug get squashed. I stood up. My legs did not shake. My heart, which had been racing, suddenly slowed into a cold, steady rhythm. I adjusted my thrift store blazer. Pulling the lapels straight, I lifted my chin. When I spoke, my voice was not loud, but it had a steel core that cut through the acoustic dead space of the courtroom. I object. Your Honor, I said. Sterling rolled his eyes. He leaned over to Victoria and whispered something that made her stifle a laugh. Judge Harrison looked at me with a mixture of patience and pity. On what grounds? Ms. Smith, do you have evidence that the will is a forgery? Do you have testimony to refute your mother's claims? I walked out of the row and stood in the center aisle. I did not look at the judge. I looked at Victoria. I wanted her to see me. I wanted her to see the sister she thought she had buried. I do not object because the will is a forgery. Your Honor, I said, my voice steady, although we all know it is, and I do not object because my mother is committing perjury, although the record will eventually show that she is. Sterling scoffed loudly. Objection. This is speculation and slander from a disgruntled heir. I ignored him. I kept my eyes locked on Victoria's. Her smirk faltered slightly. She saw something in my face that she didn't recognize. She saw the trap snapping shut. I object. Your Honor, I continued, my voice rising just enough to command the room, because this entire proceeding is a farce. You are debating the distribution of assets that do not exist. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the stenographer stopped typing. Sterling laughed. It was a nervous, barking sound. Excuse me, assets that don't exist. We are talking about skyscrapers, patent portfolios, and cash reserves. Are you suggesting they vanished into thin air? I turned to the judge. I am stating, Your Honor, that the estate of William Smith is empty. Sterling slammed his hand on the table. This is a waste of the court's time. She is clearly delusional, just as we stated. I did not flinch. I object, I said, enunciating every syllable with crystal clarity, because this court has no jurisdiction over the assets in question. As of 48 hours ago, the entirety of the Smith fortune was no longer the personal property of William Smith. It does not belong to the family. It does not belong to the company. I took a step closer to the railing. Victoria, I said, breaking protocol to address her directly, you can forge a signature on a will. You can bribe a notary. You can even get our mother to lie on a Bible. But you made a mistake. You assumed Grandpa was playing defense. I turned back to the judge. The assets were transferred. The reason I object to Victoria taking control is not because I want the money, it is because the money is already gone. Sterling looked like he had swallowed a lemon. Gone. What do you mean? Gone. I smiled. It was a cold, sharp smile that felt foreign on my face. I mean that the man walking through those doors right now is not here to attend a funeral, I said, gesturing to the rear entrance. He is here to tell you that you are fighting over a corpse that has already been picked clean. Sterling spun around. Victoria stood up, her chair scraping violently against the floor. And that was when the heavy oak doors groaned open. The timing was perfect. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The new will on the judge's bench, the lunch reservations, the fake tears, all of it was about to be rendered as meaningless as ash in the wind. I sat back down. My part was done. The stage was set for the executioner. The noise was so sudden, so violently intrusive, that the entire room seemed to vibrate. The air conditioning hummed. A fly buzzed against a high window, and then there was nothing but the sound of a heavy, deliberate footstep striking the floor. Sterling froze, his mouth still half open in a smile that was rapidly curdling into confusion. He turned his head, annoyance flashing in his eyes, ready to reprimand whatever clerk or late arrival had dared to interrupt his grand finale. But the reprimand died in his throat. A man walked into the room. He was tall, perhaps 6'4", with shoulders that filled the entryway. He moved with a fluid, predatory grace that suggested he was not accustomed to waiting for doors to be opened for him. He was accustomed to walking through walls. He was not wearing the standard navy blue or charcoal gray of the legal profession. He was wearing black. It was a suit of such terrifying perfection that it made every other garment in the room look like a costume. The fabric was matte, absorbing the fluorescent light rather than reflecting it, cut so precisely to his frame that it seemed like a second skin. It was bespoke tailoring of a level that whispered of private fittings in London or Milan, places where the doors are locked and appointments are by invitation only. He carried no briefcase. There were no messy files tucked under his arm, no frantic paralegals trailing in his wake. His hands were empty, save for a single object held loosely in his right hand. It was an envelope. It was not the standard manila yellow or legal white. It was a deep, blood-red crimson, made of thick, textured paper that looked like parchment. Sealed in the center was a glob of dark wax, stamped with an intricate crest that was impossible to decipher from a distance. The temperature in the room plummeted. It wasn't a physical cold, but a psychological freeze. The oxygen seemed to thin, making it harder to breathe. This man did not belong here. He did not belong in a county courthouse with scuffed floors and water stains on the ceiling. He belonged in boardrooms where wars were started, or in the back seats of armored limousines driving through rain-slicked streets in Geneva. He was Julian Blackwood. I knew his name, though I had never spoken it aloud until this moment in my mind. Seeing him in the flesh was different from seeing his signature on the trust documents I had studied in secret. In person. He was not a man. He was a force of nature compressed into a suit. I watched my sister. Victoria had turned in her chair, her annoyance giving way to a flicker of avarice. Her eyes, trained to spot wealth from a mile away, locked onto the stranger. She scanned him from his shoes, Italian leather, hand-stitched, worth more than the average American car to the cut of his jacket. She frowned, a crease appearing between her perfectly shaped eyebrows. She leaned toward our father, keeping her voice low, but in the dead silence. Her whisper was audible. "Dad," she hissed. "Who is that? Is that one of Grandpa's silent partners? That suit cost more than my Range Rover?" Robert Smith squinted, cleaning his glasses nervously. "I don't know. Victoria? I have never seen him before. Maybe he's from the federal prosecutor's office." "He is not a Fed." Victoria scoffed. "Feds don't wear Patek Philippe watches. Look at his wrist." Julian Blackwood ignored them. He ignored everyone. He did not look at the gallery. He did not look at the plaintiff's table. And he certainly did not look at Sterling, who was now standing awkwardly in the middle of the floor like a jester whose act had been cancelled. Julian walked straight down the center aisle. His gaze was fixed on the bench, or perhaps through it. He moved with the absolute certainty of a man who owns the ground he walks on. He reached the front of the courtroom and stopped before the clerk's desk. He did not ask for permission to approach. He simply extended his hand and placed the crimson envelope on the wooden surface. Thud! The sound was dry and heavy, like a stone dropping into a well. It echoed, a singular note of finality. Judge Harrison, who had been rubbing his temples in exhaustion just moments before, sat up straighter. He peered over his spectacles, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the envelope. Then, his gaze shifted to the man standing before him. The judge was a man of the law, a man who understood hierarchy, and he recognized instantly that the hierarchy had just been inverted. He looked at the wax seal on the envelope. I saw the judge's eyes widen. It was a subtle reaction, a quick intake of breath, but I saw it. He recognized the crest. It was a double-headed eagle holding a key and a sword, the emblem of the Sovereign Trust. The Sovereign Trust was not a bank. It was not a law firm. It was a ghost. It was an organization so exclusive, so secretive, that most people in the financial world believed it was a myth. They handled the assets of old monarchies, industrial titans who wanted to remain invisible, and families whose wealth predated the founding of the United States. They did not advertise. They did not have a website. They only had clients, and they only appeared when something had gone terribly, irrevocably wrong. Julian Blackwood straightened his cuffs. When he spoke, his voice was a deep baritone that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. It was calm, devoid of theatricality, and terrifyingly precise. "Your Honor," he said, "my name is Julian Blackwood. I represent the Sovereign Trust." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her keys, unsure if she should be typing or running. "I am not here to participate in this litigation," Julian continued. "I am here to end it. I have come to execute the Omega Protocol, established by the late William Smith 10 years ago." The words hung in the air. Omega Protocol. It sounded like something out of a spy novel, but spoken by Julian Blackwood, it sounded like a death sentence. Marcus Sterling finally found his voice. The shock had worn off, replaced by the desperate instinct of a lawyer realizing he was losing control of his courtroom. He puffed out his chest, trying to physically reclaim the space Julian had stolen. "Objection," Sterling shouted, though his voice cracked slightly. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Who is this man? He is not on the witness list. He has not been sworn in. He cannot just barge into a court of law and interrupt a summary judgment motion with some dramatic envelope. This is a disruption of legal proceedings. I demand he be removed by the bailiff immediately." Sterling looked at the bailiff, expecting the uniformed officer to step forward, but the bailiff did not move. He was staring at Julian Blackwood with a look of apprehension. Even the law enforcement in the room could sense that you did not simply put handcuffs on a man like this. Judge Harrison held up a hand, silencing Sterling. "Sit down, Mr. Sterling," the judge said, his voice sharp. "But, Your Honor." "I said sit down," Harrison barked. Sterling's mouth snapped shut. He sank back into his chair, his face flushing a deep, angry red. Victoria looked at her lawyer with disdain, realizing for the first time that her expensive attack dog had just been commanded to heel. Judge Harrison reached out and picked up the red envelope. He broke the wax seal. The crack was loud in the silence. He pulled out a single sheet of heavy, cream-colored paper. He adjusted his glasses and began to read. I watched the judge's face. I saw the blood drain from his cheeks. His skin took on a gray, waxy pallor. He read the first line, then stopped. He looked up at Julian, then back at the paper, as if he could not believe what his eyes were processing. He read on, his lips moving silently. When he reached the bottom of the page, his hand was trembling. He did not look like a judge anymore. He looked like a man who had just been told that the building he was sitting in was rigged with explosives. He slowly lowered the paper. He took off his glasses and placed them on the bench. He looked at Julian Blackwood with a mixture of fear and profound respect. "Mr. Blackwood," the judge said, his voice barely a whisper, Is this authenticated? It is notarized by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, dated 10 years ago, Julian replied smoothly, and the video evidence is in your clerk's inbox as of 1 minute ago. The judge nodded slowly. He looked as if he might be sick. Julian turned. For the first time since he entered the room, he acknowledged the existence of the people at the plaintiff's table. He pivoted on his heel, his movement sharp and military. He looked at my parents, who were shrinking into their seats. Then, his gaze landed on Victoria. Victoria was still trying to maintain her composure. She lifted her chin, trying to summon the arrogance that had carried her through 30 years of a charmed life. She met Julian's gaze, expecting to find admiration or at least acknowledgement of her status. Instead, she found nothing. Julian looked at her the way a scientist looks at a specimen in a jar, something small, insignificant, and mildly repulsive. There was no heat in his eyes, only a glacial indifference. "Ms. Victoria Smith," Julian said. Victoria swallowed hard. "Yes, who are you?" Julian took one step toward her, just one, but it felt like he had crossed an ocean. "You asked a question earlier," Julian said. "You asked if I was your grandfather's partner." He paused, letting the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. "I was not his partner," Julian said. "I was his contingency plan." Victoria blinked, confusion marring her perfect makeup. I do not understand." Julian's lips curved into a faint, terrifying smile. It was not a smile of amusement. It was the smile of a trap snapping shut. "You filed a lawsuit today. Ms. Smith, you stood in this court and demanded the immediate transfer of assets. You claimed inheritance based on a forged will. You attacked your sister's character." "So what?" Victoria snapped, her bravado flaring up one last time. "It is my right. I am the heir." Julian shook his head slightly. "By filing this suit, by entering this room, by uttering a single word of claim against the estate, you have done something irrevocable." He said softly, "You have activated the Omega Protocol." He gestured to the red envelope in the judge's hand. "You thought you were fighting for a fortune," Julian said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a rumble that I could feel in my chest. "But you were actually taking an IQ test, and I am afraid you have failed." Victoria laughed nervously. "You are speaking in riddles. Just tell me what this is about." Julian leaned in, his voice ice cold. "It means, Ms. Victoria, that the simple act of your greed has triggered a mechanism that you will wish you were never born to witness. You opened a door today thinking you would find a vault of gold. Instead, you have opened an incinerator, and you are standing inside it." Victoria's face went slack. Her hand went to her throat. The realization that something catastrophic was happening finally pierced her bubble of delusion. She looked at her father, but Robert was staring at the floor, his face ashen. She looked at Sterling, but the lawyer was frantically texting on his phone, likely checking his malpractice insurance. Julian turned his back on her, dismissing her as if she had ceased to exist. He walked over to where I sat in the back row. He stopped in front of me. The terrifying aura of power softened, just for a fraction of a second. He nodded to me, a gesture of deference that shocked the entire room. "Ms. Emma," he said, his voice respectful, "the stage is yours. The Sovereign Trust is ready to execute your orders." I stood up. I looked past him, at the trembling figure of my sister. The game had changed. The pieces were off the board, and the man in the black suit had just handed me the match to burn it all down. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, a sound that seemed to rattle the very foundations of the courtroom. He held the document with both hands, his knuckles white against the heavy cream paper. The room was so quiet that I could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead, a low electric drone that underscored the tension. "This document," the judge began, his voice projecting with a new grave authority, "is a declaration of trust. It is dated October 14th, 2016. A collective gasp went through the room. 2016. That was 10 years ago. That was long before Grandpa got sick. Long before Victoria started hovering around him like a vulture. and long before I met my late husband." The judge continued reading, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. "It states herein that on that date, Mr. William Smith transferred the entirety of his assets, including all shares in Smith Global, all real estate holdings, his personal liquidity, and his intellectual property into an entity known as the Ironclad Irrevocable Trust." Irrevocable. The word hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Even people who did not go to law school knew what that word meant. It meant it could not be changed. It meant it could not be taken back. It meant that for the last 10 years, while Victoria was parading around Manhattan acting like the heiress apparent, Grandpa technically owned nothing. He had been a penniless man living in a mansion owned by a ghost entity. Judge Harrison looked up over his spectacles, his gaze landing squarely on Marcus Sterling. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, his voice dripping with dry irony. "The will you just presented, the one allegedly signed 3 days ago, it is worthless. You cannot bequeath what you do not own. Mr. Smith had no assets to give your client. They have belonged to the trust for a decade." Sterling's mouth opened and closed like a fish on a dock. He looked at the document in his hand, the forgery he had staked his reputation on, and realized it was nothing more than expensive kindling. But the judge was not finished. He turned the page. "The trust structure is highly specific," he read. "It appoints a single individual to serve as the moral overseer. This individual does not hold the title to the money directly, but possesses absolute veto power over all distributions. The trust stipulates that wealth without character is a curse. Therefore, no beneficiary shall receive a single cent unless the overseer deems them morally fit to steward the legacy." Victoria let out a sharp, derisive laugh. "Well, who is it?" "Some bank manager. We can buy them off. Who is this overseer?" Judge Harrison looked at her. For a moment, his face softened, and he looked toward the back of the room where I had been sitting. "The appointed moral overseer," the judge said clearly, "is Emma Smith." The silence that followed was heavy, thick enough to choke on. Victoria whipped her head around to look at me. Her eyes were wide. The pupils contracted to pinpoints. My parents, Robert and Linda, looked as if they had been struck by lightning. They stared at me, the daughter they had ignored, the daughter they had tried to buy off with $10,000, and realized that I held the keys to the kingdom. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply met their gaze with a flat, impassive stare. I was not just their daughter anymore. I was their judge. "Wait!" Victoria shrieked, jumping to her feet. "This is insane, Emma. She is a nobody. She works in a basement filing papers. Grandpa would never give her that kind of power. He knew she was weak." Judge Harrison ignored her outburst and continued reading. He was getting to the part that I knew by heart, the part that Grandpa and I had discussed in hushed tones in his library years ago. "The trust contains a strict no-contest clause," the judge read, his voice becoming stern. "It states that the primary goal of this trust is to preserve family harmony and prevent greed. Therefore, any potential beneficiary who challenges the validity of this trust, or who attempts to use the legal system to alter its terms, shall be immediately and permanently disinherited." Disinherited. The word bounced off the mahogany walls. "It means," the judge clarified, looking directly at Victoria, "that if you sue, you get nothing. Zero, the moment a legal complaint is filed. The litigant forfeits their right to any future distribution." Victoria's face turned a violent shade of red. Veins bulged in her neck, ruining the smooth line of her expensive treatments. "That is a lie," she screamed, pointing a manicured finger at Julian Blackwood. "This is a fabrication. That man is a fraud. My grandfather was senile 10 years ago. He was already losing his mind. He did not know what he was signing. You tricked him. You and Emma conspired to trick an old man who could barely remember his own name." She was frantic, flailing. She was throwing every accusation she could find, hoping one would stick. "He was incompetent," Victoria yelled, her voice cracking. "I have doctors. I can get doctors to testify that he was easily manipulated. This trust is void. because he lacked mental capacity. Julian Blackwood did not shout. He did not argue. He simply reached into the breast pocket of his bespoke suit and withdrew a small, silver object. It was a USB drive. It glinted under the courtroom lights like a bullet. He walked forward and placed it gently on the judge's bench, right next to the red envelope. "Regarding the allegation of senility," Julian said, his voice smooth and cold as polished marble, "that drive contains a 4-hour video recording of the signing ceremony from 2016. He turned to face the room, addressing the audience like a professor lecturing a class of slow students. Present in the room during the signing were 3 independent neurologists, each currently chairing departments at top teaching hospitals. They conducted a full cognitive evaluation on camera before the pen touched the paper. Also present was Justice Earl Warren, a retired Supreme Court justice, who served as the witnessing notary. Julian paused, letting the weight of those names crush Victoria's argument. "In the video," Julian continued, "Mr. Smith speaks at length about his reasons. He explicitly states that he fears his granddaughter Victoria is becoming, and I quote, a shark in a goldfish bowl, and that he is creating this structure specifically to save her from her own avarice." Victoria slumped back into her chair. Her legs seemed to give out. 3 neurologists, a Supreme Court justice. The wall of evidence was insurmountable. There was no way to argue incompetence against that kind of lineup. She looked at Sterling, begging him to do something, anything. Sterling stood up, but the arrogance was gone. He looked like a man trying to defuse a bomb with a hammer. He was sweating. "Your Honor," Sterling stammered, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief, "let us be reasonable. My client did not intend to contest the trust in the malicious sense. She was exercising due diligence. She was trying to protect the estate from what she thought was a vacuum of leadership. He was grasping at straws. He was trying to redefine the word contest to save his client from total financial annihilation. Surely, Sterling pleaded, his voice rising in desperation. Filing a petition for guardianship cannot be construed as a violation of the no contest clause. She was trying to help. She was acting out of love for the family business. Julian Blackwood walked over to the plaintiff's table. He placed his hands on the polished wood and leaned in, invading Sterling's personal space. "Mr. Sterling," Julian said, "you are a lawyer. You should learn to read the definition section of the documents you are fighting." Julian pointed a long finger at the document on the judge's bench. "Turn to page 42. Your Honor," Julian directed, "paragraph 7, subsection C." Judge Harrison flipped the pages. The sound of paper turning was the only noise in the room. "The document defines a contest," the judge read aloud, "as any legal action, motion, or petition filed with any court of law regarding the administration, distribution, or control of the Smith assets without the prior written consent of the moral overseer." Without the prior written consent of the moral overseer. The trap was sprung. The steel jaws slammed shut. It did not matter what Victoria's intent was. It did not matter if she was trying to save the company or burn it down. The only thing that mattered was whether she had asked for permission, and the only person who could give that permission was me. Sterling froze. He looked at me. For the first time, he really looked at me. He saw the cheap blazer, the scuffed boots, the tired eyes, and he realized that I was the most powerful person in the room. The judge looked at me too. "Ms. Smith," Judge Harrison asked, his voice gentle, "did you give your sister consent to file this motion today? Did you authorize this petition for emergency guardianship?" I stood up again. My legs felt strong. I looked at Victoria. She was staring at me, her eyes pleading. For a second, I saw the sister I used to play with in the backyard. Before the money and the status and the cruelty took over, but then I remembered the lock on the gate. I remembered my bag in the snow. I remembered the $10,000 check she thought would buy my silence. I took a deep breath. "No, Your Honor," I said. My voice did not waver. I did not give consent. In fact, I was not even informed. I was told to take a check and disappear. I paused, letting the words sink in. I never agreed to this, I said firmly, and I never would have. The color drained from Victoria's face so completely that she looked like a wax figure. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. She was doing the math in her head. If the no contest clause held, she had just lost everything: the billion-dollar empire, the real estate, the future she felt entitled to. It was all gone. My mother, Linda, let out a low moan and grabbed my father's arm. Robert was shaking. His hands were vibrating so hard that his glasses slipped down his nose. They realized that by siding with Victoria, they had alienated the only person who could help them. They had bet on the tiger, and the tiger had just fallen into a pit. But Julian was not done. He straightened up and buttoned his jacket. He looked at the shattered family with a look of clinical detachment. "Since the no contest clause has been violated," Julian announced, his voice ringing through the chamber, "the penalties are automatic. Victoria Smith is hereby removed as a beneficiary. She is disinherited from the trust, effective immediately." Victoria put her head in her hands. A sob escaped her throat, a harsh, jagged sound. "However," Julian said, raising his voice slightly to cut through her weeping, "that is not the extent of the damage." He walked back to his position in the center of the aisle. "Mr. Smith anticipated that if his family challenged this trust, it would be because they were driven by greed and lived beyond their means. He knew that people like that tend to borrow money against inheritances they have not yet received." He looked directly at Victoria. "Therefore, the violation of the no contest clause also triggers the outstanding debt recovery provision." Victoria looked up, tear-streaked and confused. "Debt? What debt?" "I don't owe Grandpa anything." Julian smiled that terrifying, thin smile again. "You don't owe him directly." "No," Julian said, "but you owe the banks. You owe the private equity firms. You owe the venture capitalists." He pulled a second document from his pocket. "Over the last 5 years, your companies have taken out massive loans to fund your lifestyle and your failing business ventures," Julian explained. "You thought you were brilliant at securing credit? You were not. The only reason those banks lent you money was because a silent guarantor was backing your loans." Victoria's eyes widened. "No." "Yes," Julian said. "The Sovereign Trust, acting on behalf of William Smith, has been the guarantor for every single loan you have taken since 2021. We co-signed everything. We bought your debt." He took a step closer. "And the terms of that guarantee state that if you are disinherited, the trust immediately withdraws its backing. Furthermore, the trust has the right to call in the full amount of the loans immediately." Immediately. That word again. "So, Ms. Smith," Julian said, checking his watch as if he had a train to catch, "you are not just disinherited, you are now personally liable for the entirety of your business debt. We are calling the loans. Today, right now." The room spun. I could see it in Victoria's eyes. She wasn't just losing a fortune she hoped to get. She was being crushed by a mountain of debt she had already created. She had spent millions she didn't have, thinking the inheritance would cover it. Now, the safety net was gone, and the floor had opened up to reveal a bottomless pit. My father, Robert, slumped forward, clutching his chest. My mother started to hyperventilate. The perfect family was dissolving into a puddle of panic and ruin right there on the courtroom floor. And all I did was watch. Grandpa had warned me it would be ugly. He had told me, "Emma, the truth is a blade. It cuts before it heals." I just hadn't realized how deep the cut would go. Debt. Victoria screamed. The word tore out of her throat like a jagged piece of glass. She looked around the courtroom, her eyes wide and manic, searching for someone to validate her reality. "I am a millionaire. I have my own company. I have assets. I was on the cover of Forbes Under 30. She slammed her hand onto the table, causing a pitcher of water to rattle dangerously. "You are lying," she shrieked at Julian. "You are trying to scare me. My company, VS Real Estate, is valued at $60 million. We have investors. We have capital." Julian Blackwood did not flinch. He did not even blink. He simply reached into his folder and turned the page with a deliberate, rustling sound that seemed to echo in the cavernous silence of the room. He looked like a surgeon preparing to make an incision, calm and utterly detached from the pain he was about to inflict. "Ms. Smith," Julian said, his voice dropping to a register that commanded absolute attention. "Let us discuss those investors." He picked up a sheet of paper that was covered in dense rows of figures. "For the past 5 years, your company has been bleeding money. Your luxury condos in Soho sat empty for 18 months. Your renovation project in the Hamptons went 40% over budget due to mismanagement. You were facing bankruptcy in 2021. Do you remember that?" Victoria froze. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She remembered. I could see it in the way her posture collapsed. "You were saved," Julian continued, "by a sudden influx of capital from 3 private equity firms, Artemis Capital, North Star Holdings, and the Invisible Hand Group. They injected liquidity into your business, bought your bad debt, and kept you afloat. They allowed you to keep your office, your staff, and your illusion of success." "Yes," Victoria cried, grasping at this lifeline. "Exactly, I have investors. They believe in me." Julian looked at her with something approaching pity. "No, Victoria, they did not believe in you. Those companies are shell entities. They are holding companies with no employees and no offices." He tapped the document with his index finger. "They are wholly owned subsidiaries of the Sovereign Trust." The room went dead silent. Even the air conditioning seemed to stop humming. "Your grandfather," Julian said, speaking slowly so every word would sink in, "bought your debt. He knew you were failing. He knew you were too proud to ask for help and too incompetent to succeed on your own. So, he secretly bought your mistakes. He bought every bad loan, every defaulted mortgage, every credit line you maxed out. He became your primary creditor." I sat in the back row, stunned. Grandpa had never told me this. He had watched Victoria strut around at family dinners, bragging about her business deals, knowing the whole time that he was the only reason she wasn't standing in an unemployment line. He had paid for her pride. He had subsidized her arrogance just to keep her safe. "He did it to protect you," Julian explained, reading the look on my face as easily as he read the legal text. "He wanted to shield you from the humiliation of public bankruptcy. He hoped that, given enough time, you would mature. He hoped you would learn to manage your affairs. But he was also a prudent man." Julian looked back at Victoria, his eyes hardening. "He kept the debt on the books. He did not forgive it. He held it as leverage. The terms of these loans state that the Sovereign Trust has the right to demand full repayment immediately if the borrower, that is you, Victoria, engages in any conduct that threatens the integrity of the Smith family legacy." Victoria was shaking her head, a low denial bubbling from her lips. "No, no, no." "Filing a lawsuit against your sister to steal an inheritance you do not deserve?" Julian asked rhetorically. That is exactly the kind of conduct he was worried about. He looked at the judge. "Your Honor, the filing of this lawsuit today was the trigger condition. As of this morning, at 9 o'clock, the Sovereign Trust has issued a formal recall of all outstanding liabilities owed by Victoria Smith and her associated entities." Judge Harrison leaned forward, his eyes scanning the summary page Julian had placed on the bench. "Mr. Blackwood," the judge asked, his voice hushed, "what is the total sum?" Julian did not need to look at the paper. "The principal amount, plus accrued interest over 5 years, totals $45,342,018. $45 million. The number hung in the air like a storm cloud. Victoria let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. She grabbed the edge of the table to steady herself. "But my assets," she stammered. "My apartment, my car, the stocks." Julian cut her off. "We have already run the valuation. Ms. Smith, if you liquidate everything you own, the penthouse, the Hamptons property, your jewelry, your wardrobe, and your car, you will raise approximately $12 million. He paused for effect. "You are insolvent," Julian stated. You are not a millionaire. You are $33 million in the hole. And since you personally guaranteed these loans a requirement your grandfather insisted on, you are looking at personal bankruptcy. Not the kind where you reorganize and keep your house, the kind where you lose everything. I looked at Marcus Sterling, the shark of New York law, the man who supposedly never lost. He was staring at the documents on the judge's bench with a look of pure horror. He was not horrified for Victoria. He was horrified for himself. He was doing the mental calculus that lawyers do when they realize their client cannot pay the bill. Sterling slowly closed his laptop. He gathered his papers into a neat stack. He did it quietly, hoping no one would notice, but in that silent room, the sound of his briefcase snapping shut was like a gunshot. He took a step back from the table, a physical distance, a separation of church and state. "Your Honor," Sterling said, his voice tight. "In light of these revelations, specifically the financial insolvency of my client, I must request a recess. There may be a conflict of interest regarding my retainer. He was abandoning her. He was jumping off the sinking ship before the water even touched his ankles." Victoria turned to him, her eyes wide with betrayal. "Marcus, what are you doing? You have to stop this." Sterling did not look at her. He looked at the exit sign. "Ms. Smith, we will discuss this in private, but I cannot proceed without a guarantee of payment." He turned and walked toward the gallery, leaving her standing alone at the plaintiff's table. She looked small. The $5,000 dress suddenly looked like a costume she had stolen. The posture of the queen was gone, replaced by the trembling of a frightened child. Then, the movement caught my eye. My parents, Robert and Linda Smith, who had spent the last hour glaring at me, suddenly surged forward. They scrambled out of their seats like rats sensing an opening in a trap. They did not go to Victoria. They did not rush to comfort their crying, bankrupt daughter. They came toward me. Their faces had transformed. The sneers were gone, replaced by wide, terrified smiles. My mother's eyes were wet, but these were different tears. These were tears of calculation. "Emma," my mother cried out, her voice pitching up into a shrill falsetto. "Emma, darling, oh, thank God." She reached over the wooden divider that separated the gallery from the court floor. Trying to grab my hand, I pulled back, pressing myself against the hard wood of the bench. "We didn't know," my father sputtered, his face pale and sweaty. He was wringing his hands together. "Emma, you have to believe us. We had no idea Victoria was in this deep. We were misled. She lied to us. Emma, she told us everything was fine. We only supported her because we thought she was following Grandpa's wishes." My mother nodded frantically, the diamond earrings she wore bobbing with the motion. Yes, exactly. We are victims here too. Emma, your sister. She is sick. She manipulated us. But thank goodness you are here. Thank goodness Grandpa chose you. You were always the smart one. Emma, you were always his favorite." I stared at them. I felt a wave of nausea rise in my throat. It was not anger. It was disgust. Pure, unadulterated revulsion. 10 minutes ago, they were willing to watch me get thrown out of the family with nothing but a torn check. Now, seeing the power shift, seeing the money move to my side of the room, they were trying to rewrite history. I stood up. I looked down at them. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. "Stop," I said. My mother froze, her hand still reaching out in the air. "Do not call me darling," I said, "and do not lie to me." "Emma, please," my father begged. "We are your parents. We are family." "No," I said, "you are not family. You are investors who bet on the wrong horse." I turned to Julian. He was watching the scene with that same impassive expression, but I saw a flicker of approval in his eyes. "Julian," I said, "show them the rest." "Show them what my father asked," his voice trembling. Julian walked over to the gallery railing. He held the folder open, presenting a specific document to my parents. "You claim you were misled?" Julian asked, his voice cutting like a knife. "You claim you did not know about Victoria's financial situation." He tapped a signature line at the bottom of a complex mortgage agreement. "This is a deed of trust," Julian explained. It was signed 2 years ago. It authorizes a high-risk, secondary mortgage on the family estate, the house your father built, the house where he died. The loan was for $5 million. The proceeds were wired directly to Victoria's personal account to cover her gambling debts in Monaco. My father's face turned gray. "And here," Julian said, pointing to the bottom of the page, "is the signature of the guarantor, Robert Smith, and here, the witness, Linda Smith." The courtroom gasped. "You mortgaged Grandpa's house?" I asked, my voice trembling with rage. "The house he built with his own hands. You leveraged his sanctuary to pay for her gambling." It was a bridge loan." My father stammered. "She said she would pay it back in a month. She said it was a sure thing." "You used his home as collateral while he was dying inside it." I said, "You signed those papers knowing that if she failed, the bank would come for his roof." Julian closed the folder with a snap. "Actually, it is worse than that," Julian corrected. "Mr. Smith, your father did not own the house at that time. The house had already been transferred to the trust. You knew that. You signed a document acknowledging the transfer in 2016. My parents looked at each other. They knew what was coming. "So," Julian continued, "mercilessly, when you signed this mortgage deed 2 years ago, claiming to have the authority to leverage the property, you were committing fraud. You forged title documents, you lied to a lender, and you used trust property to secure a black market loan because no reputable bank would touch you." Julian looked at the judge. "Your Honor, this is not just a civil matter of inheritance. The document I am holding is evidence of bank fraud, title fraud, and elder financial abuse. Robert and Linda Smith conspired to strip equity from an asset they did not own to fund their daughter's lifestyle." Judge Harrison looked at my parents. His expression had shifted from fatigue to absolute loathing. He looked at them as if they were something he had scraped off his shoe. "I have sat on this bench for 20 years, Judge Harrison said, his voice low and dangerous. "I have seen drug dealers, murderers, and thieves, but I have rarely seen a betrayal as intimate and disgusting as this." He picked up his gavel, gripping it tightly. "This is no longer a probate hearing," the judge announced. "This is a crime scene." My mother collapsed onto the bench, burying her face in her hands. My father stood there, mouth agape, staring at the ruin of his life. Victoria was still at the table, sobbing over her lost millions, and I stood in the middle of it all, the only one standing tall, watching the house of cards come down. They had come here today to bury me. Instead, they had dug their own graves, and the man in the black suit had just handed me the shovel. The declaration that our family drama was now a crime scene did not silence the room. Instead, it acted like a lit match thrown into a pool of gasoline. The tension that had been building for the last hour, layer by layer, finally detonated. Victoria did not cry. She did not beg. She snapped. It happened in the blink of an eye. One moment, she was standing by the plaintiff's table, trembling in the wreckage of her financial life. The next, she was a blur of black silk and unbridled rage. She didn't lunge at the judge. She didn't lunge at Julian. She came for me. "You witch," she screamed, the sound tearing out of her throat like a banshee. She vaulted over the low wooden partition that separated the legal well from the gallery. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure hate, her eyes bulging, her teeth bared. She looked less like a Manhattan socialite and more like a feral animal cornered in a trap. Her manicured hands were curled into claws, aiming straight for my face. I flinched, bracing myself for the impact, but it never came. 2 court officers moved with the speed of linebackers. One of them caught Victoria by the waist, tackling her momentum just 2 feet away from me. The other grabbed her arm, spinning her around. She thrashed against them, her expensive heels scraping violently against the linoleum floor. She was kicking, biting, spitting a complete disintegration of dignity. "Get off me!" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceiling. "It is her fault. She did this. She poisoned him." She glared at me over the shoulder of the bailiff, her chest heaving. "You brainwashed him." "Emma," she yelled, her voice raw. You sat by his bed and whispered lies into his ear. You made him hate us. You manipulated a dying man because you were jealous. You are a manipulator, a snake. I sat perfectly still. I did not recoil. I did not shout back. I just watched her unravel. It was fascinating, in a morbid way, to see how her mind worked. She could not accept that her own greed was the architect of her downfall. In her narrative, she was always the victim, and I was always the villain. She had to invent a story where I was a master manipulator because the truth that I simply loved Grandpa and she did not was too painful for her to process. While Victoria was struggling in the grip of the bailiffs, another movement caught my eye. Marcus Sterling was moving, but he was not moving to help his client. He was moving toward the exit. He had gathered his briefcase and his coat, and he was walking with a brisk, determined pace toward the heavy oak doors. He looked like a man fleeing a burning building, not caring who he stepped on to get to fresh air. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Harrison barked, slamming his gavel down. "Where do you think you are going?" Sterling stopped, his hand hovering over the door handle. He turned slowly, his face pale. He looked at Victoria, who was still screaming in the arms of the bailiffs, and then back at the judge. "Your Honor," Sterling said, his voice trembling slightly, "I am formally withdrawing from this case effective immediately." On what grounds, the judge demanded. "Conflict of interest," Sterling blurted out, and potential criminal liability. I was not informed of the fraudulent nature of the documents my client provided. I was led to believe the will was authentic. I was led to believe the assets were solvent. I cannot represent a client who has used my firm to perpetrate a fraud upon this court. He was cutting her loose. He was terrified that if he stayed for one more minute, the fraud charges leveled against my parents would splash onto him. He was saving his license, his reputation, and his own skin. "I resign as counsel," Sterling said, his voice rising in panic. "I will be submitting a formal affidavit to the Bar Association regarding my lack of knowledge. Good day, Your Honor." And with that, he pushed the door open and vanished. He left Victoria alone in the center of the storm she had created. Victoria stopped struggling for a second, watching the door swing shut. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her lawyer was gone. Her shield had evaporated. She pulled herself free from the bailiffs, smoothing her dress with shaking hands. Her eyes were darting around the room, wild and desperate. She looked at Julian, then at me, and then a light of frantic inspiration turned on in her eyes. She reached into her purse and ripped out her smartphone. "You think you can stop me?" she hissed, her fingers flying across the screen. "You think you have won? I have accounts you do not know about. I have money in the Caymans. I have crypto. I am moving it all, right now." She was tapping furiously, logging into her offshore banking apps, trying to drain whatever liquidity she had left before the walls closed in completely. It was the instinct of a thief: grab what you can and run. I saw her unlock her phone with Face ID. I saw her thumb hovering over the transfer button. "I have $3 million in the escape fund," she muttered to herself, her voice trembling. "I am transferring it to a secure wallet. You will never touch it." Julian Blackwood stood by the clerk's desk. He did not move to stop her. He did not signal the bailiffs. He simply watched her with a look of profound boredom. He lifted his left arm and checked his watch, a Patek Philippe that probably cost more than the house I grew up in. "Go ahead, Victoria," Julian said. His voice was calm, cutting through her panic like a cold wind. "Press the button." Victoria looked up at him, snarling. "Watch me." She slammed her thumb down on the screen. She waited. Then, she frowned. She tapped the screen again and again. "What? What is this?" she whispered. She held the phone up, staring at it in horror. "Why is it declined?" she screamed. "It says access denied. It says account frozen." She frantically swiped to another app, then another. My cards, my accounts. Why are they all red? Why can I not move anything? Julian lowered his arm. He adjusted his cufflink. "Ms. Smith," Julian said, sounding as if he were explaining gravity to a toddler. "Did you really think the Sovereign Trust operates on banking hours?" He took a step forward. The Omega Protocol is not just a legal document, it is a digital containment system. The moment Judge Harrison read the case number into the record at 9:02 this morning, our algorithm automatically cross-referenced your social security number and biometric data with every major financial institution in the world. Victoria stared at him, her mouth agape. We froze your domestic accounts at 9:03, Julian continued relentlessly. We flagged your offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland at 9:05, and your cryptocurrency wallets. We traced those through the blockchain and locked the exchange keys 3 minutes ago. He paused, letting the crushing weight of his words settle on her shoulders. You do not have a penny in the world that you can access, Julian said. You could not even buy a pack of gum at the vending machine in the hallway. You are destitute, Victoria, and you are stuck here. Victoria dropped the phone. It hit the floor with a crack, the screen shattering. It was a perfect metaphor for her life. Suddenly, a loud thud from the gallery drew everyone's attention. My mother, Linda. She had been standing there, clutching her pearls, watching her daughter's destruction and her husband's exposure. Now, sensing that the spotlight of accountability was swinging toward her, she decided to pull the ripcord. She let out a soft moan, rolled her eyes back in her head, and collapsed onto the wooden bench. It was a feint so theatrical that it would have been rejected by a soap opera director. She slumped sideways, making sure to land in a way that did not wrinkle her skirt. Linda. Oh my God! Linda, my father yelled. Dropping to his knees beside her, he started fanning her face with a legal pad. She fainted. Someone call a doctor, the stress. It is too much for her heart. I watched them from my seat. I didn't move. I didn't feel a flicker of concern. I knew my mother. She didn't have a heart condition. She had an accountability condition. She was playing the fragile victim, hoping that if she looked pathetic enough, the judge would go easy on her. I sat there, amidst the screaming sister, the fleeing lawyer, and the fainting mother, and I felt a strange, cold peace. A memory of Grandpa surfaced in my mind. We were sitting on the porch, watching a storm roll in over the Hudson River. He had told me, Emma, never interrupt your enemy when they are making a mistake, and never fight a battle that time will fight for you. The true nature of a person is not shown when they are winning. It is shown when they lose. Strip them of their comfort, and they will eat each other alive. I looked at my father. He was terrified. He wasn't terrified for his wife. He was terrified for himself. He saw the bailiffs looking at him. He saw the judge's disgust. He needed a scapegoat. Robert stopped fanning Linda. He looked up at Victoria, who was standing over her shattered phone, hyperventilating. This is your fault, Robert shouted, pointing a trembling finger at Victoria. Victoria looked up. Stunned. My fault. Yes. Yours. Robert scrambled to his feet, abandoning his fainting wife. You told me this was safe. You told me the mortgage was just a formality. You said you had insider information that the real estate market was going to boom. I said no such thing, Victoria screamed back, her tears drying instantly in the heat of her anger. You were the one who wanted the money. Dad, you begged me to find a way to pay off your bad investments in that tech startup. Do not pretend you are innocent. Robert turned to the judge, his face red and sweaty. Your Honor, Robert yelled, desperate to be heard. She is lying. She forged the documents. She brought me the papers and told me to sign. I didn't know what I was signing. I am an old man. I trusted my daughter. You are a liar, Victoria shrieked, advancing on him. You signed those papers because you wanted a new boat. You used $500,000 of that loan to buy a yacht that you hide in Florida. A boat? I closed my eyes for a second. They had mortgaged Grandpa's legacy to buy a boat. You ungrateful brat, Robert roared. I funded your company I covered for you when you embezzled from the charity fund last year. I gasped involuntarily. Embezzled. They were confessing. They were so busy trying to destroy each other that they forgot where they were. They forgot the court reporter was typing every word. They forgot the microphone was recording. I covered that up for you, Robert shouted, incriminated himself completely. I paid off the accountant so you wouldn't go to jail. And this is how you repay me, by dragging me into a fraud case." Victoria laughed, a manic, hysterical sound. "You didn't do it for me. Dad, you did it because you were the chairman of the board. If I went down, you went down. We are in this together, you old fool." The courtroom was silent except for their shouting. It was a circular firing squad. They were tearing each other apart, ripping open old wounds, exposing every secret, every crime, every lie they had buried for years. They were doing the prosecutor's job for him. Julian Blackwood stood with his arms crossed, watching them with the impassive gaze of a grim reaper. He didn't need to say a word. The outstanding debt was just the opener. Their own mouths were the closers. Enough. Judge Harrison's voice was like a thunderclap. He stood up, his face thunderous. He slammed the gavel down so hard that the handle cracked. Everyone. Silence. Robert and Victoria froze, panting, looking at the judge like children caught standing over a broken vase. "This court has heard enough," Judge Harrison said, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "You have turned my courtroom into a circus. You have confessed to multiple felonies on the record. You have admitted to fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy." He pointed to the bailiffs. "Officers, take them into custody, not the jail. Secure them in the holding room adjacent to this court." He looked at my father, then at Victoria. "I am issuing a temporary detention order. No one leaves this building. I am having the clerk contact the district attorney's economic crimes division. They are on their way." "But, Your Honor," Robert pleaded, "I am a victim." "You are a suspect, Mr. Smith," the judge roared. "Sit down and shut up." 2 more officers entered the room. They surrounded my father and Victoria. They helped my mother, who had miraculously recovered from her faint the moment the word detention was spoken, to her feet. They were herded like cattle toward the side door, the door with the heavy bars. As they were led away, Robert was still muttering, blaming Victoria. Victoria was sobbing. Looking at her broken phone, Linda was weeping softly. They passed by me. For a second, the procession stopped. Victoria looked at me. Her eyes were red, swollen, and filled with a fear so deep it looked like madness. "Emma," she whispered, "help me, please." I looked at her. I looked at the sister who had thrown my bag in the snow. I looked at the father who had torn my check. I looked at the mother who had called me a mistake. I said nothing. I simply turned my head and looked at the empty chair where Grandpa used to sit in my memory. "Take them away," the judge ordered. The door slammed shut behind them. The lock clicked. And for the first time in 10 years, the air in the room felt clean. The silence that followed the removal of my family was heavy, but it was not empty. It was filled with the dust of settling debris. The courtroom, usually a place of sterile judgment, felt like a battlefield after the cannons had stopped firing. I remained in my seat, the hard wood pressing against my spine, feeling a strange exhaustion seep into my bones. It was not the tiredness of sleep deprivation. It was the fatigue of holding up a crumbling wall for too long. Julian Blackwood moved from the center of the room. He walked toward me, his steps quiet on the polished floor. The terrifying aura of the Grand Inquisitor had softened, replaced by the demeanor of a loyal steward who had finally completed a difficult watch. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, the same pocket that had held the destruction of my sister's life, and pulled out a different envelope. This one was not red. It was a soft, creamy white. It was smaller, intimate. It did not have the wax seal of the Sovereign Trust. It was sealed with a piece of simple Scotch tape, yellowed slightly with age. "For you, Emma," Julian said softly, handing it to me. "He wrote this 6 months ago. He made me promise to give it to you only when the dust had settled." I took the envelope. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from a sudden, overwhelming wave of grief. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was shaky. The loops of the letters jagged a testament to the tremors that had plagued him in his final year, but the slant was unmistakable. It smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and peppermint, the scent that had defined my childhood. I tore it open. My dearest Emma, the letter began. I felt tears prick my eyes. I blinked them back, needing to see the words clearly. If you are reading this, then the worst has happened. It means Victoria chose greed over family. It means your father chose cowardice over integrity. And it means you are sitting in a room where you feel entirely alone. You are not alone, kiddo. You never were. I took a shaky breath. I need you to know the truth about the end. The letter continued. I need you to know that I was not as lost as I seemed. I know about the medicine. Emma. My heart skipped a beat. The medicine. I knew Victoria was switching my prescriptions. Grandpa wrote, I knew the pills in the blue bottle were not for my blood pressure. They were mild hallucinogens and sedatives. She didn't want to kill me. She is too calculated for murder. She just wanted to keep me confused. She wanted me pliable. She wanted me to sign papers in a fog. A chill ran down my spine. I had suspected it. I had seen the way his eyes would glaze over after she visited, the way he would ramble about things that didn't make sense, but to hear that he knew, that he was aware of the betrayal while it was happening. I let her do it. He wrote, I faked the severity of the confusion. I pocketed the pills under my tongue when I could, and when I couldn't. I rode out the fog. I had to let her believe she was winning. It was the only way to see how far she would go. It was the only way to gather the evidence needed to protect the legacy for you. You were the only one who never looked at me and saw a bank account. You looked at me and saw your grandfather. The papers shook in my hands. I closed my eyes, and the courtroom dissolved. I was back in the hospital room, 3 months ago. It was 2:00 in the morning. The only light came from the blinking monitors and the street lamps outside filtering through the blinds. I was sitting in the uncomfortable vinyl chair, reading a book, listening to the rhythmic rasp of Grandpa's breathing. He had gripped my hand then, his fingers weak and insistent. Emma, he had whispered, don't let them turn the lights off. I won't, Grandpa? I had soothed him. I'm right here. I remembered the door opening an hour later. Victoria had breezed in. She was wearing a cocktail dress, fresh from some gala. She smelled of champagne and expensive perfume, a scent that clashed violently with the antiseptic smell of the hospital. Is he asleep? She had asked, not bothering to lower her voice. He's resting, I had whispered. Victoria had walked over to the bed. She didn't touch him. She didn't brush the hair off his forehead. She pulled out her phone. She angled herself so the lighting was flattering, put a sad, concerned expression on her face, a perfect mask of tragedy, and snapped a selfie with his unconscious form in the background. Posted, she had muttered a minute later, typing out a caption. Fighting the good fight with Grandpa. Family is everything. #love, #legacy. Then she looked at me. You look terrible. Emma, go home. I can't have you looking like a zombie at the funeral. It reflects poorly on the brand. I'm staying, I had said. Suit yourself, she had shrugged. I have an after-party at the Pierre. Call me if he, croaks. She had left after exactly 7 minutes. I opened my eyes, returning to the present. The letter was still in my hand. I saw you that night, Emma. The letter read, as if he had pulled the memory right out of my head. I heard her, and I heard you stay. That was when I knew. That was when I told Julian to activate the Onyx protocol. I looked up at Julian. He was watching me with a sad smile. You knew too, I asked, my voice hoarse. I knew everything, Julian replied softly. I looked back at the letter. They think you are a clerk. Emma, Grandpa wrote, they think you work at a dead-end job filing papers. Let them think that. But you and I know the truth. I built Onyx Archives for you. I didn't just give you a job. I gave you a weapon. I smiled through my tears. Onyx Archives. To the outside world. It was a data storage facility in Queens. To my family. It was a place for losers. But the reality was something else entirely. Grandpa had funded it 5 years ago, hiring 3 of the best ex-NSA analysts in the country. He had made me the CEO, though my name appeared on no public documents. For 2 years, I hadn't been filing papers. I had been learning forensic accounting. I had been tracking digital footprints. I was the one who found the shell companies Victoria was using to siphon money. I was the one who traced the wire transfers to the Cayman Islands. I was the one who flagged the forged mortgage documents my father had signed. I wasn't just a grieving granddaughter. I was the lead investigator in the case against my own family. You have the sharpest mind in the family, the letter concluded. You just lack the cruelty to use it. I hope you never learn the cruelty. But I wanted to make sure you had the power. Use it well, my dear. Build the library, save the legacy, and forgive them, if you can. Not for their sake, but for yours. Hate is a heavy stone to carry. Love, Grandpa. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my pocket, right next to my heart. From the holding room adjacent to the court, a muffled sound drifted out. It was the sound of a voice raised in desperate, impotent anger. "Get me Senator Reynolds," I heard Victoria scream through the heavy door. I donated $50,000 to his campaign. Get him on the phone. I looked at Julian. "She is trying to call in favors," I asked. Julian nodded, checking his tablet. "She has made 12 calls in the last 4 minutes. Senator Reynolds, Councilman Miller, even the bishop. And no one is answering," Julian said. "The news broke on Twitter 10 minutes ago. Socialite Victoria Smith, arrested for fraud in courtroom meltdown. The video of her attacking you is already trending. She has become toxic. Emma, in this town, you can be a criminal, but you cannot be an embarrassment. She is both. No one will touch her." I felt a pang of pity, not for the woman she was, but for the delusion she was trapped in. She still thought there was a manager she could speak to, a bribe she could pay. She didn't realize the currency had changed. Julian sat down on the bench next to me. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his hands clasped. "There is one more thing you should know. Emma," he said, "something William wanted me to tell you only after the outcome was decided." "What is it?" I asked. Julian looked at the closed door of the holding room. "The Omega Protocol had a failsafe," he said quietly, "a path of redemption." I frowned. Redemption. "Your grandfather knew they were greedy," Julian explained, "but he also wanted to give them one last chance to prove him wrong. He wrote a clause into the trust, a peace offering clause." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. If Victoria had come into this courtroom today and simply accepted the will, if she had hugged you and honored his memory without fighting for control, if she had just been a sister instead of a shark, the trust would have automatically released a cash gift. I stared at him. "How much?" $1 million, Julian said. "For each of them. 1 million for Victoria, 1 million for Robert, 1 million for Linda. Tax-free. No strings attached. It was sitting in an escrow account, waiting for the moment the judge asked if there were any objections. If they had said, no objection, the money would have transferred to their accounts before they left the building. I felt the breath leave my lungs. $1 million. It wasn't a billion, but it was enough. It was enough to pay off the mortgage on my parents' house. It was enough to give Victoria a fresh start if she sold her company. It was a lifeline, and all they had to do to get it was to be decent human beings for 5 minutes. "But they couldn't do it," I whispered. "No," Julian said. "They couldn't. They wanted it all, so they ended up with nothing." Just then, the door to the holding room cracked open slightly as a guard entered to give them water. Julian's voice, deep and carrying, had drifted through. $1 million, we heard my mother shriek from inside the room. It was a sound of pure, agonizing regret. Did he say $1 million? Robert's voice followed, sounding like a wounded animal. "We could have had the money. We just had to shut up." "Why didn't you shut up, Victoria? Why did you have to sue?" "It's a lie," Victoria screamed back, though her voice sounded broken. "He is lying to make us feel bad." "It is not a lie," my father wailed. "I know my father. He always tested us. We failed the test. We lost the money. Oh God, we lost the money." They weren't crying because they had lost their father. They weren't crying because they were going to prison. They were crying because they had walked past a pile of gold while chasing a mirage. Even in their ruin, Their grief was monetized. I stood up, smoothing my blazer. I didn't want to hear it anymore. The tragedy wasn't that they were poor. The tragedy was that they were hollow. At that moment, the main doors of the courtroom swung open again, but this time, it wasn't a lawyer or a ghost. It was a man in a uniform covered in brass, the chief of police. Behind him were 4 detectives in plain clothes, carrying boxes and scanners. Julian Blackwood stood up to meet them. "Chief?" Julian said, nodding. "Mr. Blackwood," the chief replied. He looked at me and tipped his cap. "Miss Smith, I am sorry we have to meet under these circumstances." He held up a piece of paper. "We have a warrant," the chief said. "We are authorized to seize all electronic devices, financial records, and physical assets belonging to Victoria Smith and Robert Smith. We have teams en route to the penthouse and the Hamptons estate right now." He looked toward the holding room. "Are they secure?" "They are," Julian said. "Good. The district attorney wants them transported to central booking within the hour. The charges are piling up: wire fraud, forgery, conspiracy to commit grand larceny, and—" The chief paused, looking uncomfortable. "We found evidence in the initial data sweep of tax evasion. Significant tax evasion. The IRS is sending their own agents." It was over. It wasn't just a family dispute anymore. It was a federal case. A young court clerk, a girl no older than 22, hurried over to me. She looked flushed, her eyes wide with excitement and fear. "Ms. Smith," she whispered, leaning in close. "Yes." I just thought you should know." She stammered. "I went downstairs to get coffee. The front steps. They are gone." "Gone." "The press," she said. "There are hundreds of them. CNN, Fox, the New York Times. There are vans with satellite dishes. They are calling it the succession trial of the century. They know everything. They know about the debts, the forgery, everything." She looked at me with a mixture of awe and pity. "They are waiting for a statement. They want to know who the mystery heiress is." I looked at Julian. He was waiting for my command. The secret was out. The quiet life I had built at Onyx Archives, the anonymity I had cherished, it was all gone. I looked at the chief of police. "Do what you have to do." "Chief," I said. I turned to the clerk. "Tell them I have no comment," I said. "Tell them the only statement that matters was made by my grandfather 10 years ago." I touched the pocket where the letter sat. The evidence had been buried for a decade, hidden in a trust and a pill bottle and a fake job. But now, it had risen, and it had buried them. The arrival of the police was not merely a response to the chaos within the courtroom. It was a synchronized strike, as the chief of police spoke with Judge Harrison. Julian Blackwood leaned toward me, his voice barely rising above the ambient noise of the room. "The police are here for the fraud." "Emma," Julian said calmly. "But the men in the gray suits behind them, they are from the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service." I looked at the agents standing by the door. They were nondescript, blending into the woodwork, but they carried themselves with the lethal quiet of predators who have already cornered their prey. "You see," Julian continued, "Victoria made a classic mistake. She believed that because she controlled the family narrative, she could control the math. But math is stubborn." He opened a new file on his tablet and slid it toward me. "For the last 5 years, Victoria has been operating a private foundation called the Golden Horizon Charity. On paper, its mission was to support underprivileged artists in the tri-state area." I nodded. I had seen the galas on social media. I had seen the photos of Victoria holding champagne glasses, smiling next to minor celebrities, claiming to be a patron of the arts. It was a ghost ship. "Emma," Julian said, "the foundation raised $12 million over 5 years. Do you know how much was actually dispersed to artists?" I looked at the spreadsheet. The number was 0. "Exactly," Julian said. 0. Instead, the funds were used to purchase artistic assets for the foundation's office, specifically, a penthouse apartment on Park Avenue that she claimed was a gallery space, a fleet of luxury vehicles classified as transport for visiting dignitaries, and questionable travel expenses to Paris and Milan, listed as cultural scouting trips. He tapped the screen. She was using a tax-exempt charity to fund her lifestyle tax-free. That is not just unethical, that is a federal crime under Title 26. Section 7, 201 of the United States Code. Tax evasion. I looked at the holding room door. They had no idea. They thought they were being held for a scuffle in court. They did not realize that the United States government was about to drop a hammer on them. The irony, Julian added, a dry smile touching his lips, is that she convicted herself today. I frowned. How? The asset declaration, Julian said. Remember the list Marcus Sterling read out loud at the start of the hearing? The list intended to prove she was a capable manager worthy of the estate. I remembered. Sterling had proudly listed her properties, her investments, and her holdings to show the judge she was a serious businesswoman. She listed assets on the public record that she has never declared on her tax returns. Julian explained. She admitted, under oath and recorded by the court stenographer, to owning properties that the IRS did not know existed. Sterling essentially read her confession into the record. The chief of police finished his conversation with the judge and turned toward the holding room. He signaled to his officers. "Bring them out," the chief ordered. The door opened. My family was led out. They looked disheveled. Victoria's mascara was running. My father's tie was askew. My mother looked like she was walking to the gallows. They expected to be reprimanded. They expected a slap on the wrist. Instead, the chief of police stepped forward, holding a document that was not a citation. "Victoria Smith Vanderbilt," the chief announced, his voice booming. "Robert Smith, I have a warrant for your arrest issued by the Southern District of New York." "Arrest," Robert squeaked. "For what? We were just arguing. It was a civil dispute." "You are being charged with conspiracy to defraud the United States, wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft." The chief read. "Identity theft," Victoria snapped, trying to regain a shred of her old arrogance. "I am a Vanderbilt. Who would I steal from?" From the donors of the Golden Horizon charity, an IRS agent stepped forward to answer, and from the taxpayers. The agent looked at Robert. "And you, Mr. Smith, you are listed as the executive director of the charity. Your signature is on every fraudulent tax return filed since 2021. My father's knees buckled. He grabbed the bailiff for support. "No," Robert cried out. "I just signed what she gave me. She told me it was for tax breaks. She said it was legal." "Ignorance of the law is not a defense, Mr. Smith," the agent said coldly. "You signed the returns under penalty of perjury. You certified that the funds were used for charitable purposes, while you were simultaneously approving payments for your daughter's vacations. Officers, execute the warrant." The reality of the situation crashed down on Victoria. This was not a lawsuit she could settle. This was not a bad headline she could wait out. This was prison. Federal prison. She began to scream. "No, you cannot touch me. My grandfather built this city. I am an heiress." She thrashed as the officer grabbed her wrist. The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting shut was sharp and metallic. Click, click, click. "Get your hands off me," she shrieked, kicking out. "This is a mistake. I will sue you. I will sue all of you." The officer forced her arms behind her back. She bent forward, her hair falling over her face, stripping away the last illusion of the Manhattan socialite. She was just a criminal fighting the inevitable. My father, Robert, did not fight. He wept. He held his hands out meekly, letting them cuff him. He looked small. He looked like a man who had spent his whole life hiding behind his father's money and his daughter's ambition. And now that the cover was gone, he was nothing. My mother, Linda, was not cuffed. She was not named on the charity board. She stood there, watching her husband and daughter being restrained, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She looked around the room, desperate for a lifeline. Her eyes landed on the judge. He looked away. She looked at Julian. He was stone. Then she looked at me. "Emma," she cried out. She ran toward me. The bailiff stepped in to block her, but I raised a hand. "Let her speak," I said. Linda rushed to the wooden railing, gripping it with white-knuckled desperation. Her eyes were wide, filled with a terrifying mixture of panic and manipulation. "Emma, you have to stop this," she pleaded. "They are taking your father. They are hurting your sister. Do something. You have the power now. Julian listens to you. Tell them to stop." I looked at her. I looked at the woman who had given birth to me. The woman who had spent 30 years ignoring me because I wasn't shiny enough, successful enough, or ruthless enough. "Tell them it is a misunderstanding," Linda begged. "We are family. Emma. Family sticks together. We share the same blood. You cannot let them drag us away like animals." Family. The word hung in the air, tasting of ash. I stood up slowly. I walked to the railing until I was face to face with her. I could smell her expensive perfume, now sour with the sweat of fear. "Family," I repeated quietly. "Yes," Linda sobbed. "We are your family." I looked her dead in the eye. "Where was this family last week?" "Linda," I asked. She blinked, confused. "What?" "Last Tuesday," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that was colder than the winter wind. "When Victoria threw my bag into the snow. When she told the security guards to physically remove me from the only home I had ever known." Linda stammered. That was... Emotions were high. "It was 12 degrees below zero." I said. I had nowhere to go. I didn't have a car because Victoria had taken the keys. I stood at that gate for an hour, shivering, waiting for a taxi. I leaned in closer. "I saw you in the window. Linda, I saw you standing in the living room, holding a glass of wine, watching me freeze. You saw me. You saw your daughter standing in the snow in the middle of the night." Linda recoiled, her face pale. "You didn't open the door," I said. "You didn't call me. You didn't throw me a coat. You closed the curtains." I thought," Linda stuttered. "You thought I was gone. I finished for her. You thought I was out of the picture. So I didn't matter anymore. You didn't treat me like family then. You treated me like garbage." I straightened up, looking down at her. "You broke the bond. Mother, not me. You decided that money was thicker than blood. Now that the money is gone, don't come looking for the blood. It is not there for you." Linda stared at me, her mouth open, the realization of her own cruelty finally reflecting back at her. She slumped against the railing, defeated. Julian stepped forward. He held a clipboard with a single document attached. "Officers," Julian said to the police, "before you transport the suspects, there is one final administrative matter regarding their residence." He handed the clipboard to me. "This is the notice of eviction and trespass," Julian said. "It applies to the Smith family estate, the Hamptons property, and the Manhattan penthouse. All titles have reverted to the trust." He offered me a pen. "By signing this, you are formally declaring that Robert, Linda, and Victoria Smith are unauthorized occupants. It authorizes the immediate removal of their personal effects and bars them from re-entering any trust property." I looked at the paper. It was just a signature, but it was also a guillotine. If I signed this, they would have no home to return to if they made bail. They would have no closet to retrieve their clothes. They would be homeless. I looked at Victoria, who was now being dragged toward the door, weeping. I looked at Robert, head bowed in shame. I looked at Linda, broken against the railing. They had not hesitated to do this to me. They had done it with a laugh. They had done it with a glass of wine in hand. I took the pen. I did not hesitate. I did not shake. I signed my name, Emma Smith. The loops were large, confident. The ink was dark and permanent. I handed the clipboard back to Julian. "It is done," I said. Julian nodded to the officers. "Take them away." The police resumed their march. Victoria screamed one last time, an incoherent wail of despair as she was shoved through the double doors. My father followed, silent as a ghost. My mother was helped away by a female officer, looking back at me one last time with eyes that were no longer calculating, but empty. The doors swung shut. The heavy thud echoed through the courtroom. I stood there, in the sudden silence, feeling the weight of the pen still in my hand. I had stripped them of their fortune, their freedom, and their home. I looked at the judge. He nodded at me, a gesture of grim respect. I looked at Julian. "What happens now?" I asked. Julian checked his watch. Now the IRS seizes the assets, the banks foreclose on the debts, and you, Ms. Emma, you have a board meeting at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. I took a deep breath. The air tasted different. It no longer smelled of stale perfume and lies. It smelled of a clean slate. "Let's go," I said. "I have a library to build." The sun went down over New York City, but there was no darkness for the Smith family. They were bathed in the harsh, unforgiving glare of a different kind of light, the 24-hour news cycle. I sat in the back of Julian Blackwood's town car, watching the small television screen embedded in the headrest. The volume was low, but the headlines screamed. The banner at the bottom of the screen was a relentless red ticker: real estate tycoon Victoria Smith, arrested in federal fraud sweep. Smith family empire under investigation for tax evasion. The reporter stood in front of the courthouse steps, the wind whipping her hair, her voice breathless with the magnitude of the scandal. Behind her, the footage cut to a pre-recorded clip that was already looping on every screen in America. It was the perp walk. There was Victoria, just this morning. She had walked into court like a queen, draped in $5,000 of black silk. Now, on the screen, she was being led out of the side exit of the courthouse by two federal marshals. She was not wearing silk. Her blazer had been confiscated for evidence. She was in a simple white dress shirt that looked disheveled, stained with sweat and tears. Her hands were cuffed behind her back. Her head was bowed. Her hair, usually a helmet of perfect blonde waves, was a tangled mess shielding her face. As she was guided toward the waiting police van, the wind blew her hair back, exposing her face to the cameras. It was a mask of ruin. Her makeup was smeared in dark streaks down her cheeks. Her mouth was open in a silent sob. For a fleeting second, she looked directly into the lens, and the entire world saw the terror of a woman who had realized that her universe was made of glass, and someone had just thrown a brick. The news anchor's voice cut in. "In a shocking turn of events, shares of VS Real Estate have plummeted 90% in after-hours trading. The Securities and Exchange Commission has halted all activity on the stock." Citing catastrophic irregularities, analysts say the company, once valued at $60 million, is effectively worthless. Effectively worthless. Two words that erased a decade of Victoria's posturing. The car moved slowly through the traffic, but my phone was moving faster. I opened social media. It was a bloodbath. The video of Victoria being led out of her penthouse building was trending at number 1. The police hadn't just arrested her. The IRS had seized the physical assets. The video showed movers bringing out boxes of her possessions: her designer handbags, her limited edition art, her fur coats. All of it was being loaded into a nondescript white truck. The caption on the video read, "The Queen of Manhattan gets evicted." But the most brutal part was not the strangers commenting, it was the friends. I clicked on the profiles of the women Victoria called her inner circle, the bridesmaids, the gala partners, the women she went to brunch with every Sunday to sneer at the less fortunate. Chloe, her best friend since prep school, had posted a photo of a sunset with the caption, "Focusing on positivity and authentic people today. So sad when you realize you never really knew someone." She had unfollowed Victoria. Madison, her business partner, had issued a press release on Instagram. "I am shocked and appalled by the allegations against Ms. Smith. I have severed all professional ties effective immediately." They were erasing her. It was a digital damnatio memoriae. They were scrubbing their timelines, deleting photos where they stood next to her, untagging themselves from her life. Victoria had built her entire identity on the validation of these people, and before she even reached the booking cell, they had already decided she never existed. Julian turned from the front seat. "We have received an update on your parents," he said quietly. I looked away from the screen. "Where are they?" "They are being held at the Metropolitan Detention Center," Julian said. The judge set bail at $5 million for your father and $2 million for your mother, citing them as extreme flight risks. I nodded. Do they have it? Julian shook his head. Their personal accounts are frozen. Their credit cards are declined. They made several calls to friends, associates, even distant cousins. No one picked up. They are in the general population holding unit. I imagined my mother, Linda, in a holding cell. I imagined her sitting on a metal bench next to women who had stolen bread to feed their children. Women my mother would have crossed the street to avoid. I imagined her realizing that her pearls meant nothing in a place where the currency was cigarettes and intimidation. It is poetic justice, isn't it? I said, looking out the window at the passing city lights. They locked me out in the cold because I had no money. Now they are locked in a cage because they have no money. Julian did not answer. He just signaled the driver to turn left. We were not going to my apartment. We were going home. The iron gates of the Smith estate loomed out of the darkness. This was where I had stood a week ago, shivering in the snow, watching the movers throw my bag down the stairs. The for sale sign Victoria had prematurely placed on the lawn had already been ripped down, likely by the wind or an angry creditor. The car stopped. The driver waited. Victoria had changed the locks on the pedestrian gate. She had installed a keypad that required a code I didn't have, but she had been so focused on keeping me out physically that she had forgotten how the house actually worked. I stepped out of the car. I walked to the stone pillar beside the gate. Hidden under a decorative bronze sconce was a small, sleek panel. It was the biometric scanner Grandpa had installed 5 years ago when he upgraded the security system. Victoria used the keypad because she liked numbers. Grandpa used the scanner because he trusted biology. I placed my right thumb on the glass. For a second, nothing happened. I held my breath, wondering if she had wiped the system, if she had been thorough enough to erase my digital fingerprint along with my physical presence. Then, a soft blue light pulsed. A mechanical click echoed in the silence. The heavy iron gates began to swing inward, groaning slightly on their hinges as if welcoming an old friend. She changed the code, I whispered, but Grandpa never deleted my user profile. I walked up the long driveway. The house was dark. The electricity had not been cut, but there was no one inside to turn on the lights. It looked like a mausoleum, a grand stone monument to a dead era. I walked up the front steps. I bypassed the shiny new lock Victoria had installed on the front door and went to the side entrance, the service door that led to the kitchen. I used the same thumbprint. The door clicked open. I stepped inside. The air was stale. It smelled of floor wax and neglect. I walked through the dark kitchen, my footsteps echoing on the tile. I moved into the hallway, trailing my hand along the wall. I walked past the formal dining room where we had eaten silent, tension-filled dinners. I walked past the living room where my mother had watched me freeze. I went straight to the library. This was the room Victoria wanted to bulldoze. She wanted to turn it into an infinity pool. She wanted to replace the smell of old leather and paper with the smell of chlorine. I flipped the switch. The amber lamps flickered to life, casting a warm glow over the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. It was exactly as I remembered it. The globe in the corner, the worn leather armchair, the stack of books on the side table. I walked over to the desk. It was covered in dust. Victoria hadn't even bothered to clean it. She was just going to demolish it. I sat down in Grandpa's chair. It creaked, a familiar sound that made my chest ache. I opened the center drawer. It was locked, but I knew where the key was taped underneath the desktop, a habit Grandpa had since I was 6. I found the key. I opened the drawer. Inside, there was no money. There were no jewels. There was just a large roll of paper, tied with a blue ribbon. I pulled it out and unrolled it on the desk. They were blueprints, but they weren't for a pool or a garage. The title block in the corner read, "The William Smith Center for Youth Innovation." I traced the white lines with my finger. It was beautiful. It was a design for a school, a sanctuary for underprivileged kids who had talent but no resources. Kids like I would have been if Grandpa hadn't taken me in. There were classrooms for coding, studios for writing, labs for robotics. And in the margin, in Grandpa's shaky handwriting, was a note for Emma, because you were the only one who understood that wealth is a tool, not a trophy. Build this for me. Tears finally spilled over. He hadn't just left me money. He had left me a mission. He knew Victoria would never build this. She would have turned the land into a parking lot. He had hidden his true legacy in the one room she despised, waiting for the one person who would look for it. The silence was broken by the harsh, jarring ring of the landline phone on the desk. I stared at it. Who would be calling the house line? Everyone used cell phones now. I picked up the receiver. Hello? There was a pause, filled with the static of a bad connection and the background noise of shouting and clanging metal. This is a collect call from a federal detention facility, a robotic voice announced, from inmate Victoria Smith. To accept the charges, press 1. I hesitated. My finger hovered over the button. I could hang up. I could let her scream into the void. But I needed to hear it. I needed to know if there was anything left of my sister. Or if she was truly gone. I pressed 1. Victoria, I said. Emma. Her voice was shrill, desperate, and filled with a venom that even prison couldn't dilute. You answered. You have to get me out of here. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't apologize. She went straight to the demand. It is filthy in here, Emma Victoria screamed. There are rats. The woman in the next cell keeps screaming. You have to call Julian. Tell him to release the funds. Tell him it was a mistake. Victoria, I said calmly, I can't do that. Yes, you can. You are the overseer. She practically spat the title. You can sign a waiver. You can tell the judge you forgive me if you drop the charges. They might let me out on house arrest. I listened to her panic. It was the sound of a narcissist confronting reality and rejecting it. Emma, listen to me, she pleaded, her voice cracking. I am your sister. You cannot leave me in here. I am Victoria Smith. I am not supposed to be in a cage. You aren't in a cage because of me. Victoria, I said, you are in a cage because you stole. You stole from the government. You stole from the charity. You stole from Grandpa. I did what I had to do, she shrieked. I was maintaining the image. I did it for the family name. You don't understand business. Emma, you are just a mousy little clerk. You are jealous of me. You have always been jealous of me because I shine and you disappear. I closed my eyes, even now, wearing a prison jumpsuit. She thought she was the sun. You are right. Victoria, I said softly, I don't understand your kind of business. The kind that mortgages a dying man's home to buy a yacht. The kind that kicks a sister out into the snow. I opened my eyes and looked at the blueprints on the desk. But I understand legacy. I said, You stole my inheritance, Victoria screamed. You thief. You planned this. You and that old man plotted against me. I didn't steal anything from you. Victoria, I said, my voice steady and final. You had a choice today. You could have had $1 million and a fresh start. You could have had a family. But you chose to fight. I stood up, holding the phone away from my ear as her screaming intensified. I didn't take your future, Victoria. I just stopped you from stealing Grandpa's past. I hung up the phone. The click was soft, but it felt like a heavy door slamming shut on a dark room. I stared at the phone for a moment, then I reached down and unplugged the cord from the wall. I sat in the silence, breathing in the smell of the library. It was over. The screaming, the scheming, the fear, it was all gone. The door opened behind me. I didn't turn around. I knew the footsteps. Julian Blackwood walked into the room. He stopped by the desk, looking down at the blueprints I had unrolled. He knew you would find them, Julian said. I looked up at him. Is it true, I asked, about the power? Julian nodded. As the moral overseer and the sole remaining beneficiary of the sovereign trust, since the others have been disqualified, you have absolute control. You own the voting shares of Smith Global. You own the real estate portfolio. You own the patent library. He paused. You are now the chairwoman, Emma. I looked at the blueprints again. The William Smith Center. It would cost millions to build. It would require land. It would require an endowment. I want to sell it, I said. Julian raised an eyebrow. The company? No, I said. The vanity. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dark grounds. I want to liquidate VS Real Estate. I said, sell the luxury condos, sell the Hamptons house, sell the penthouse, sell every single asset that Victoria bought to feed her ego. I turned back to Julian. I want to take that money, the money she used to hurt people, the money she used to fake her success, and I want to put it into this. I tapped the blueprints. I want to build the youth center. I want to fund scholarships for kids who have been kicked out of their homes. I want to create a grant for artists who were cheated by fake charities. Julian smiled. It was the first time I had seen him smile with genuine warmth. He would have liked that. Julian said, he would have liked that very much. And one more thing, I added. Yes. The name, I said. We are rebranding the corporation. No more Smith Global. No more VS Real Estate. What will you call it? I looked at the simple, sturdy lines of the library, the place where the truth had been kept safe for a decade. Onyx, I said. We are calling it the Onyx Foundation, because it stays in the dark to protect the light. Julian nodded slowly. A fitting name. He closed his folder. I will have the papers drawn up by morning. Ms. Smith, the board will be ready for your instructions at 9. He turned to leave, but stopped at the door. By the way, he said, the police found your duffel bag, the one she threw out. It was in the garage. I nodded. Burn it. Julian. Burn it. Yes, I said. The clothes in that bag belong to a victim. That woman doesn't exist anymore. Julian bowed his head slightly. Understood. He left the room, closing the door behind him. I sat back down in Grandpa's chair. I picked up a pen from the desk, a heavy fountain pen with gold trim. I held it in my hand, feeling its weight. I looked at the window. The sun would be coming up soon. It would rise over a city where Victoria was in a cell, where my parents were facing the consequences of their greed, and where I was no longer invisible. I pulled a fresh sheet of paper from the drawer. I wrote the date at the top, January 30, 2026. Then I wrote the first line of my new life. To the Board of Directors. The cleanup begins today. 6 months had passed since the heavy oak doors of the courtroom slammed shut on my family. 6 months is a short time in the grand scheme of history, but in the life of a human being, it is long enough to shed an old skin and grow a new one. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass window on the 45th floor of what used to be the VS Real Estate headquarters. The sign on the building no longer flashed my sister's initials in arrogant neon pink. It now bore a discreet, elegant logo, the Onyx Foundation. The interior had changed too. I had stripped away the white leather couches, the gold-plated fixtures, and the pretension. The office now smelled of mahogany and fresh coffee. It felt like a place where work was done, not where egos were stroked. I looked at my reflection in the glass. The woman staring back at me was familiar, yet entirely foreign. Gone was the oversized wool coat that I used to hide inside like a turtle in a shell. Gone were the scuffed boots and the posture of apology. I was wearing a tailored navy suit that fit me perfectly, not because it was expensive, though it was, but because I finally felt comfortable taking up space. My hair was pulled back in a sleek bun, and my eyes, once shadowed by sleepless nights and fear, were clear and steady. I was no longer the poor relation. I was the chairwoman. The city of New York sprawled out beneath me, a grid of lights and noise. Somewhere out there, in a federal facility in Danbury, Connecticut, Victoria was waking up to a metal bunk and a breakfast tray she had no choice but to eat. The trial had been swift. The evidence Julian and I had compiled was so overwhelming that her defense attorney, a public defender appointed after Sterling fled, had advised her to plead guilty to minimize the sentence. She didn't listen. Of course, she screamed at the judge, she threw a pitcher of water at the prosecutor, and in the end, her tantrums earned her the maximum sentence. 12 years. Victoria Smith, the self-proclaimed Queen of Manhattan, was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for wire fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy. She would be 45 years old when she walked free. By then, the world would have forgotten the name she tried so hard to brand on every skyscraper. My parents fared slightly better in the eyes of the law, but perhaps worse in the eyes of their own vanity, because they had cooperated at the last minute. Turning on Victoria to save their own skins, they avoided prison time. They received 5 years of probation. But the financial judgment was absolute. The court seized everything: the yacht, the cars, the hidden accounts, even my mother's jewelry collection. They were left with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a small stipend from the state welfare system. Julian had told me the news last week. They had moved to a small, one-bedroom apartment in a rusted complex in Ohio, a place where no one knew who the Smiths were. My father was working part-time as a greeter at a discount superstore. My mother was reportedly spending her days sitting on a porch chair, staring at a parking lot, telling anyone who would listen that she used to be royalty. I felt a ghost of sadness, but it was distant, like a memory of a bad dream. I did not hate them anymore. Hate requires energy, and I had better things to do with mine. A soft knock on the door broke my reverie. "Come in," I said, turning away from the window. Julian Blackwood entered. He was wearing a gray suit today, a subtle shift from the funeral black he had worn in the courtroom. He carried a leather folio under his arm. He looked at me, and then at the view. "You look like him," Julian said quietly. I smiled. "Grandpa?" "No," Julian corrected, walking over to the desk. "You look like the person he wished he could be." He had the vision. Emma. But he was always burdened by the guilt of how he made his money. You are using the money to wash away the guilt. Your vision is sharper than William's ever was." "That is high praise coming from the man who holds the keys to the skeletons," I replied, sitting down at the massive oak desk. "It is the truth," Julian said. He placed the folio in front of me. "The scholarship fund papers are ready for your final signature." I opened the folder. The Second Chance Initiative. This was my answer to the cruelty of my family. It was a scholarship program designed specifically for young people who had been disowned, marginalized, or cut off by their families for refusing to conform. It provided full tuition, housing, and most importantly, legal protection for students who wanted to pursue arts, technology, or social work, the very careers my parents had sneered at. I picked up the pen. It was the same fountain pen I had used to sign the eviction notice. But today, the ink didn't feel heavy. It felt light. "How many students are in the first cohort?" I asked. 50, Julian answered. "We have applicants from all over the country. One of them is a girl from Kentucky whose parents kicked her out because she wanted to be a writer instead of a beauty queen." I paused, the pen hovering over the paper. "A writer." "Approve it," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Approve all of them. If we run out of money, we will sell another one of Victoria's vacation homes." "We will not run out," Julian assured me. "The liquidation of the Cayman accounts yielded more than we anticipated. It seems your sister was very good at hoarding cash. If nothing else." I signed my name. The signature was bold. Emma Smith. As I handed the folder back to Julian, the door opened again. A young woman walked in. She couldn't have been more than 22. She was clutching a stack of files against her chest as if they were a shield. Her blazer was slightly too large, probably a hand-me-down or a thrift store find. She looked terrified. Ms. Smith," she stammered. "Yes," I asked gently. I have the quarterly reports you asked for," she said, her voice trembling. "I am sorry they are 5 minutes late. The printer jammed, and I tried to fix it, but I got ink on my hands, and I didn't want to ruin the paper, so I had to reprint." She was rambling, her eyes wide with panic. She was expecting to be berated. She was expecting the Victoria treatment, the screaming, the insults, the threat of termination for a minor mistake. I stood up and walked around the desk. "What is your name?" I asked. "Sarah," she whispered, bracing herself. I reached out and took the files from her shaking hands. Then, I pointed to a stain of blue ink on her finger. "Sarah," I said, smiling warmly, "do you know what that ink tells me?" She shook her head. looking like she was about to cry. "No, ma'am. It tells me that you know how to fix a printer," I said. "It tells me that you care about the quality of your work enough to reprint it. And it tells me that you solve problems instead of waiting for someone else to do it." Sarah blinked, confusion replacing the fear. You aren't mad." "Mad." I laughed softly. "Sarah, in this building, we do not judge people by their clothes or their small mistakes. We judge them by their ability and their integrity. And you clearly have both." I walked back to my desk and placed the files down. "Take a breath. Sarah, you are doing a great job. And please, go down to the cafeteria and get yourself a coffee on the company account. You look like you need it." Sarah stared at me for a long moment. Then, a genuine smile broke across her face, transforming her anxious features. "Thank you, Ms. Smith," she said, her voice steadying. "Thank you so much." She turned and left the room, walking a little taller than when she had entered. I watched the door close. I looked at Julian. He was smiling. "That was a very different management style," he noted. "It is the only style that matters," I said. I sat back in my chair. My gaze fell upon two objects sitting on the corner of my desk. The first was a framed photograph of Grandpa. He was laughing, caught in a candid moment on his boat, the wind messing up his white hair. The second object was a toy. It was a small, wooden gavel, chipped and worn. He had given it to me when I was 7 years old, after I had broken up a fight between two neighborhood kids. He had told me, "Emma, you have a judge's heart. Always use it to protect, never to punish." I reached out and touched the smooth wood of the toy gavel. For so long, I had thought that justice was about punishment. I thought it was about seeing Victoria in handcuffs and my parents in ruin. And for a moment, in that courtroom, it had been, I won't lie, seeing their masks crumble was satisfying. But as I sat here now, 6 months later, I realized that punishment was just the demolition phase. Just as true justice was the rebuilding. The money hadn't changed me. It hadn't made me cruel like Victoria or indifferent like my parents. It had simply removed the obstacles that kept me from being myself. Money does not change people. I thought, running my thumb over the handle of the gavel, it just peels away the layers. It acts like a magnifying glass. If you are small and mean, money makes you a monster. If you are kind and broken, money gives you the glue to put yourself back together. My family had worn masks of wealth to hide their moral bankruptcy. Today, the masks were shattered, and I was finally seeing the world with my own eyes. I picked up the toy gavel and brought it down gently on the desk. A soft thud echoed in the quiet room. "Case closed, Grandpa," I whispered. I turned my chair back to the window. The sun was fully risen now, casting a golden light over the Hudson River. The city was waking up, full of noise and chaos and possibility. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the air of a new day. It was over, and it was just beginning. The screen fades to black. White text appears in the center of the darkness. Justice sometimes arrives late, but it always arrives on time for those who know how to wait. Thank you so much for listening to this story on Daisy Revenge Stories. We put our hearts into crafting these tales of justice and redemption, and we hope you felt every twist and turn along with Emma. Where are you listening from today? Are you tuning in from a bustling city like New York, or a quiet town in the countryside? Let us know in the comments below. We love reading about where our community is in the world. If you enjoyed seeing the greedy get what they deserved, please smash that like button. Subscribe to Daisy Revenge Stories, and hit the hype button to help this story reach more people. Your support means the world to us, and helps us bring you more dramatic, satisfying revenge stories every week. See you in the next video.